Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, it is with great pleasure that I continue on through our journey with the films that are gathered in this wonderful curated series, which has the title of Pioneers of African American Cinema. This time, I'd like to focus our attention on the work which is directed by the filmmaker Richard Norman. And the work here is a film, or to be more specific, a fragment of one reel of the film from 1923, which is called Regeneration. Now, a quick word about Richard Norman, who was a filmmaker during these times, the late 19-teens and then into the 20s. And he was a white filmmaker, but his films, many of his films, were films that might be considered to be race films, in that he focused in on stories involving African American characters, and thus had African American casts as the actors to these films, and play out the stories that are being depicted on the silver screen. And these were then marketed or shown to African American audiences during the time. And he was a kind of pioneer and an entrepreneur. And Richard Norman, was also making films that were very popular. According to all the historical record, many of his films, including this film, Regeneration, were very popular among audiences. And it's easy to see why, because all accounts seem to suggest that, for example, this film, Regeneration, is a film that is a very exciting film, an action-adventure film, and also it appears to have been also a romance film. It involves a buried treasure, and it involves the ocean, and sea voyages, and ships, and shipwrecks, and fights, and good guys and bad guys, and stranded on deserted islands, and further fights ensuing, and things of that nature. And so this, just based on my very crude description, I think one can tell immediately that films like Regeneration and other films that Richard Norman made were really very exciting, and they had the potential of being very thrilling to audiences of the day. And indeed, as I suggested, according to historical record, as recounted by the many scholars and film historians and experts in the field of race cinema and the films of Richard Norman, these films apparently were very popular. And so they enjoyed a lot of popularity among the audiences of the day. Now, Richard Norman is also very interesting in the context of a discussion of African American cinema, because he is a white filmmaker. And he is a white filmmaker whose films could, and I think are, generally regarded among film studies scholars to be in the field of race cinema, that is cinema or African American cinema. And so this is, I think, a very interesting development, because as we have seen in past films discussed in the context of pioneers of African American cinema, we have seen, for example, filmmakers that, or film production companies that were white, that were making films that involved African American characters. And so recall, for instance, our past discussion of, for example, Ebony Film Corporation. And we saw films like Reckless Rover, for instance, or Mercy, the Mummy Mumbled, for instance. And I think one of the questions that was raised in the discussions, and it still exists to this day, is to what extent can we really regard these films as exemplars of race cinema or African American cinema, or were there depictions of racial stereotypes, and were there reinforcements of racial stereotypes embedded within those films? And that debate and that discussion, I think, is carried on in the academic circles, I think, to this day. But with respect to Richard Norman, we have to remember that, as I say, his films were very popular. And the critical consensus back in the day, and also I would suggest even now, based on my general understanding of the available scholarship, is that his films are considered to be positive depictions of African American characters that have strong characteristics that are usually displayed with a sense of honesty and earnestness and realism, and that are depictions that were also very popular amongst African American audiences at the time. So which is to say that his films, Norman's films, are generally regarded to be films that don't reinforce racial stereotypes, but rather avoid them, or eschew them, or avoid them, or really do not give way to those sorts of racial stereotypical depictions, but rather give the audience positive and honest depictions with stories that are also very enthralling and entertaining and exciting. And so that is one of the reasons, that's one of the main reasons, I think, why his films, or a selection of his works, are being included in this particular set, and I think quite rightly so. As I suggest, the scholarship suggests that much, and if you are interested in further exploration of Richard Norman's work, I would strongly suggest checking out some of the sources that I've tried to list in the description box below. And you will find a more robust, fuller discussion about Richard Norman and his works than I am able to provide, because they are experts in this field and I am not. But as I say, based on this understanding, therefore, Richard Norman's works are very important. Now, unfortunately, not many of them survive, and at least as of now, many of them are considered lost. So what is surviving, I think, is very valuable and precious for what it is. We will be discussing another one of Norman's works in a separate video, which is called The Flying Ace. And so that's also part of this set. But today, the film is Regeneration. The title is Regeneration. Or, to be more specific, it is a fragment of what is known as Reel 2 of Regeneration. And for those of you who have seen this fragment that is available, again, it's based on the only existing materials of this film. Unfortunately, as we know, this particular print, or these particular materials, have been subject to a great deal of film decomposition, such that the image itself is unfortunately marred by a lot of decomposition evidence. And so when we see this, it's very hard to make out most of the time what's going on, and there's a lot of sort of discolored and warped film images, which prevent us to fully be able to appreciate what's going on in this fragment. And so on its merits, I think it's very difficult, unfortunately, to try to gain an appreciation of this film, Regeneration, and what it is. And as I say, it was a very exciting, according to the record, it was a very exciting work. And when I see this particular excerpt, which is about 11 minutes, again, Regeneration, 1923. When I see this excerpt, I must admit it is very difficult to make out what's going on. And so I would suggest, if you're interested, just pausing at certain moments and just trying to freeze frame at exact moments to really get as best appreciation as you can of the images and what's being captured here on celluloid. Because, as I say, it's unfortunate on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is some part of the frame that we can make out. And so if we freeze frame it, then we can really maybe hopefully get a better appreciation of what is being filmed. And again, this is something that's not surviving. So the fact that something is surviving at all, I think, is so important, and that alone, I think, is worth cataloging. Of course it is, and it's worth watching. And that is also to say that a discussion and an explanation about the plot, I think, will be found in a lot of the secondary materials that I've tried to list in the description box below, the bibliography and other secondary materials that are listed there. And so I strongly suggest, if you're interested in finding out more about what Regeneration, what the film was about, what were the production history details about it, how was Richard Norman as a filmmaker, and how did he cope with certain of the aspects of the production, apparently according to historical record and research done by many great scholars. It was an expensive film to make. It was successful financially, thank goodness for Richard Norman, but at the same time it was an expensive film to make. And so this just goes to show the types of demands and challenges that Richard Norman and cast and crew faced when they were making a film like Regeneration, which makes it even more of a shame, I suppose, on the one hand, that it's not surviving. But at the same time, what is also surviving are the stories and the scholarship. And so I think that's what makes the scholarship and the essays and the secondary materials prepared by these great historians and scholars who have been working so long and so hard on materials like Richard E. Norman films and other sources of that nature. That's what makes those even more important. And this is my way of saying also, please give your support to those great scholars, those great historians, those great film studies academics and experts who have really been giving a lot of their time, their energy, and their lives, really, their professional lives in trying to preserve whatever it is they can, even though the actual film elements themselves, such as with this work, Regeneration, might not necessarily be in the best of condition. And so I think I really want to applaud a lot of the scholars, or all the scholars that are listed down below. There are many others, of course. The bibliography that I have below is limited. It is not exhaustive. So hopefully, if you're interested in knowing more about Norman, more about Norman Studios and his production studio and the company, and his sort of entrepreneurial independent spirit, and his drive and his energy, and his he was apparently, according to record, he was a great showman, and he knew how to market his films, and he had a plan of how to attract audiences' attention and to create a nice sense of excitement around films that he was trying to release in order to generate buzz and to generate to generate interest, and so public interest. And so Richard Norman himself is fascinating as a figure, both as a filmmaker and artist, and also as a marketer and as someone who really was trying to make films that catered to the audiences that he was interested in. And so he makes for a fascinating figure to study and to read up on, and which is another reason that I strongly suggest checking out some of those materials that I've tried to list in the sample bibliography that I've listed below. So once, if you're interested, my friends, if you're interested. But with this film, with this fragment, Regeneration, let me just reiterate one more time as a way of concluding that it is a fragment, and it is a fragment that is unfortunately subject to a lot of decomposition. And so once again, it might be difficult to evaluate on its own merits just by watching it itself. But even if we watch it itself, my friends, we can still appreciate that this is something that is surviving of the past, and we can make out certain things if we freeze frame and we just take our time with it, because it is worth it. And also there are many sources of scholarship that give us some insight and background into the film Regeneration, and also Richard Norman as an artist himself. And also there are other works, there are other things by Norman that have survived. And one of the highlights of that will be the next video, which will be on The Flying Ace, that film by Richard Norman. So I look forward to talking with you about that. But in the meantime, my friends, here we have the film, or the fragment of Reel 2 of this film from 1923 from this filmmaker, Richard Norman, which is called Regeneration. Once again, it is tough to appreciate, I understand, because of the condition that it's in, but just give it your best shot, and just work with it with delicacy. And there are moments that you can make out in terms of framing, in terms of how characters are positioned on the screen, in terms of the language used in the intertitle cards, that we can kind of make out if we work with it slowly. And this will hopefully give us a sense of the type of treatment and care and dedication and respect that Richard Norman was giving to his actors and to the subject matter in the context of his films, amongst which, of course, is this film from 1923, Regeneration, a fragment of Reel 2 of which is included as part of Pioneers of African American Cinema. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now, and so please join me next time, where we will once again talk about The Flying Ace. I'm looking forward to this one very much. But in the meantime, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you so much again, my dear friends, for your time. As always, take care, be well, stay safe, and cheers.